Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Talking with Teal. I'm Ryan Nakade, and today I have on Jim Cowan. Jim, how are you, buddy?
I'm okay. I'm in good shape.
Great, great. I am really excited to talk to you today, and we're going to be talking about the new book that you just released on basically how to make the UK go teal.
Yeah.
Before we,
Does your audience understand Teal?
yeah, most of them do.
Okay.
Given that the podcast is called Talking with Teal, I hope they do.
Okay.
Or else they'd be very confused. But
Yeah.
yeah. But
Should we just say that Teal is about a next stage of human consciousness, just
sure,
to make it
yes,
simpler? And it's at odds with a kind of materialistic kind of rationalism. Yeah.
right.
That Wilbur calls orange. I mean, it started out more humanistic hundreds of years ago,
Mm,
but has been systematically become eroded into a very crude kind of rationalism, really.
yes.
But also, we've got amber, we've got ethnocentric kinds of ways of doing things together, where you're either in or you're out. And then we've got red ways of doing things in prisons and sadly in the UK with gang violence, knifing going on across the whole country. Really shocking levels of violence in the UK at the moment.
Right, right.
We've got a full spectrum here.
Oh yeah.
We're talking about moving towards teal. Yeah.
Yes, yes. We need it badly. And so before we get into the content of your book, can you just start by sharing a little bit about your background and how you got into this kind of work?
I in the 70s I discovered that I could work with people in communities, working class people on council estates, and I could do something that in America is called community organizing, which Obama came from in Chicago. And in Britain, we call community development. And I got hooked into community development during the 70s, and I've stayed with it for 40 years. And I've worked with lots and lots of different kinds of communities on lots of different kinds of issues. Family issues, family support issues, race and racism, anti-racism during the 80s, institutional racism in the UK, disability communities, working with deaf people, people with neurological conditions, people with learning disabilities, whole range. And because in Britain we've got a huge investment in public services through the welfare state, and we still have a huge amount of money going into it, despite appearances. Yeah, invariably that's taken me inside these kind of organizations at the same time. So I've been working inside inside communities in public services, because they are like communities inside those big organizations, and working with communities in society. So it's been a background where you really see what is going on in the country from the ground up, and because of what people tell you about their lives and what you experience from your own life. At the same time as doing all of that, I've gone and accumulated 5 social science degrees.
Oh my God.
Including the PhD. So, I've been keeping track of where those disciplines, where those understandings take us while doing work in society, which the social sciences are about. So it's been quite an intense process of understanding the country. And so I've got a book which weaves both those understandings together. But there's a third thing as well. And I've been a Buddhist for 40 years, which is where the internal development of my life, or the upper left quadrant, as the Teal 4 quadrants would have it, that's been getting a really serious look in throughout the whole process. So a lot of being, a lot of doing, and a lot of thinking.
Yeah, you've been around the block for sure.
That's
And
right.
I could definitely connect with you. I grew up in a Buddhist family. My mom's a minister.
All right.
So yeah, we definitely have a point of connection there. But let me just share with you kind of a funny story. So I've been increasingly interested in civil society and the potential that civil society as a major societal sector has in the world. And I was actually talking to my girlfriend. I think a couple days before you reached out to me when I read your book, and I told
Yeah, yeah,
her, I said, the future of the, I said, I'm going to make a big prediction here. The future of society is not going to be government. It's not going to be the economic sector. It's going to be civil society. And that is really where the emerging teal consciousness, integral consciousness will be birthed. And
yeah.
then 2 days later, I read your book, and that was pretty much to me like the thesis of your books. It was fantastically synchronistic, and I was absolutely thrilled. And it was a sign. She was like, this is the universe, speaking to me. So,
Right, and that's
yeah,
incredible.
yeah. So
That's
that's how
really
I would
remarkable.
describe your book in a nutshell: is harnessing the untapped potential of civil society to fill in the gaps in addressing and healing societal issues in ways that the government and the private sector cannot.
Yeah,
Yeah, how is that? Would you say that that's accurate?
with one exception. I think there are, and this is a bit Britain, but in the public services in Britain, there are people doing amazing Teal-like things. And in business in Britain, we've got something called social enterprises. We're up to about 70,000 now. And community interest companies that are formed not only to make money, but to have social purpose in really strong kinds of ways. They're forming at a very fast rate now. We've got a lot of employee-owned organizations forming at a fast rate as well. So the logic of capital and the logic of humanity, from a business standpoint, the two are starting to come together more and more. So it isn't just civil society, but the civil society, I think, is the very bedrock of why we live in these kind of countries and these kind of societies, because we're born into families. And families, we're often in communities, but at the point that we start to engage with organizations, or we start to engage with the state, things become much, much, much more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
If we're in a community, if we're in a family, or we have a network of friends, and we're with ourselves in our own life, then we have something much more familiar, something much more human, something that we can interact with, much less complex. So to have that as a driving kind of influence, in a way, is kind of reclaiming organizations, reclaiming politics, reclaiming the state, reclaiming business, in the name of humanity.
Reminds me, you used a term in the book that I never heard before, but I absolutely loved it. It was the word relational welfare.
Yeah.
Yeah, could you kind of expand on that? Explain what that is?
This is where you do housing, you do education, you do social care, you do health, you do criminal justice. And if you just take those 5 big areas, they are all about relationships. However, in Britain, for the last 40 years, an attempt has been made to ignore the self-evident fact that they are about relationships and turn them into numbers, procedures, managerial targets, audits, inspections, private sector disciplines of contracting, service level agreements, anything but relationships.
Right. And that's the orange, right? The orange consciousness or
Big
meme.
time, big time,
Yeah.
big time. In this very sort of degenerate version of rationalism, very materialistic, it's very suspicious of the inner world.
Right. Very reductionistic.
Yeah. But, probably implemented, enacted in Britain more rigorously probably than anywhere else in the world. Well, I don't know everywhere else in the world, but I've seen it operated in Britain, and it's been quite devastating really for the country. Chapter 2 of my book is really more or less saying, can we have done with this, please?
Right.
And can we move in this much more relational direction? I think the nub of relational, not just relational welfare, but relational anything, is that I don't feel I'm having to live in your world, and you don't feel you're having to live in my world. That we are developing a shared understanding of the worlds we wish to live in. I got that from John Schotter.
The intersubjective
Yeah.
world, right? The lower left quadrant integral terms.
Yes. Yeah. 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 I mean, in a way, we're doing that here in this podcast, aren't we?
Yeah, it is trying to be a Teal podcast. So
Yeah. 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 It's a
definitely.
relational. There's a relational podcast. Yeah.
Right, right. And I think it's easy for a lot of people, especially I can imagine very large bureaucratic settings and kind of top-down managerial arrangements where it's very easy to overlook and underestimate the value and the power of relationships and not putting a lot of conscious attention into cultivating that area. And having been in the nonprofit world some, and my girlfriend's been very involved in these kind of community-oriented
Yeah. Yeah.
grassroots projects, we really appreciate the power of, especially for helping people who are really having a rough time,
Yeah.
people who are really at the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah.
Those human connections can be so catalyzing and transformative for people in ways that pure material support can't
Oh,
reach.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. The I think the qualities of a teal, what I've got in the book here on page 56, is a very embracing human relationships, people bringing the whole of themselves to the activity, and the simplicity of a community working together without any outside interference, becoming quite autonomous, really, self-determining. I know it sounds simple, but it's actually quite hard to achieve within the current framework. Yeah, so you've had some direct experiences of being in a shared goal or goals being shared, and that understanding sort of less clear for some people, more clear for others, some leadership issues.
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Right.
but by and large, a group of people able to bring themselves to something which, if they don't do it together, it doesn't happen. And if they try and do it as individuals, it doesn't happen. They can only do it together. And nobody else is getting them to do it. They are deciding to do this.
Right.
Well, I think that's majestic. And Britain is crawling with this. It's a really profoundly deep, strong civil society. Thank goodness. It's one of the great ironies. I'm not sure that it's really a debate about, is capitalism changing, or is democracy on the wane? Is democracy dying? I'm not sure that those, for me, are the really interesting kind of understandings. For me, it's is this new consciousness actually real?
Mm.
Is a new kind of relationship between the state, civil society, and business taking place? In other words, let's get beyond those words of capitalism. Let's get beyond those words of democracy, and think about the fundamentals surrounding the human life and communities, and where we want to live and where we want to be. Are we creating sustainable wealth that has humanity? And I think that that's a model. That last chapter of the book is a model for a sustainable future, which is not industrial revolution oppression.
Right. Right.
It's that we have got state organizations. We do have businesses. My goodness me, we do. But if their focus is on the reason we're here is because of people, because of families, because of communities, because of this town, because of this neighborhood, and then we're orientating ourselves to the support of that in doing our profit-making activities, in doing our public service activities. We're orientating ourselves around something really solid. Whereas at the moment, it's out of control.
And I'm wondering if we can, I mean, your book lists a whole bunch of really good examples of how this is happening. And I'm wondering if we can kind of go into some of the specifics about how some of these Teal initiatives have really helped out families and people on the ground in these
Yeah, yeah,
communities. If you could just pick,
yeah.
I mean, you have so many examples, you know, just pick one and kind of describe it. Your favorite one.
My favorite one, I think in some ways it's participle and the family groups
Mm.
in the family chapter, because we take family so much for granted. I mean, you only have to see a young person killed on the street in London, with a knife that's been stuck in them, and then see the family reaction. It's a powerful reminder of just how important family is. or in your case, somebody with a gun goes into a school and starts shooting. In America, fortunately, we don't have that kind of position here, but it's taking another form. But you can't take families for granted. You can't take the possibility that some forms of family support should be beginning to be offered within the society, because without it, the family is a fundamental unit of the whole of the society. It's where we're born into, it's where people get socialized, get supported, get development. You know, in Wilber's terms, it's growing up, isn't it?
Right, right.
Yeah, there's this whole developmental process taking place within a family. The state isn't doing it. The state doesn't care. Business isn't doing it. Families are doing it. So, you know, if that, and you know, the family is morphing. we have step arrangements. We have all kinds of different sorts of. We have same-sex families. You know, there's all kinds of ways in which family can happen. But fundamentally, it's a space in which development can really take place, and in which young people can be really properly supported through all the different stages of development. So if that starts falling apart, the whole society starts falling apart. You can't get away from that. So I think one of my favorite Teal initiatives was an organization that no longer functions in Britain because it could not get sustainable funding from the state. Very significant. And it called itself Participle, and you can just Google it, you know, Participle. It'll show up their learning that they've put up on the web from the 10 years in which they operated. But they formed circles of support. They brought people together across a whole community. A very small sum being paid in got you an emergency telephone number. It got you social activities that were organized by the community. It got you friendships that you would otherwise never have. It got you meeting spaces. You could have a life of being in the society finally, instead of stuck in your home, isolated on your own, or being on welfare benefits where nobody cares about you.
Mm.
And they work with families too. They went and sat in somebody's front room and watched all the public service people coming through their front room, and how it didn't do anything for that family. And so they said to those local public services, put aside some money that those families control and let them decide who works with them and for why. And the results were much, much better. Much, much better. And in the same sort of area of family support, I found myself working in 1979 through to 81 with something called family groups. And so there was a process of finding local people who could run these groups, a training program. This is ordinary people, not being paid huge sums of money, nothing like the professional salaries, just quite modest sessional amounts of money. And they would be two of them. There'd be one to work with adults. There'd be one to work with children. The family group would emerge from their efforts at finding people in their locality who wanted to meet and work together and do activities, make things, bake things, eat things.
Best part.
Yeah, yeah. And what they discovered was that there's this business of the first time a person comes through that door, that they feel genuinely welcomed from the heart. And even if they don't want to participate, they just want to sit on the edge of it. 3 months go by maybe, and then suddenly they offer something. It becomes clear that they can offer something. They can show everybody else how to do something. And that's the first time that they've done this in their life. This person may not read. They may not know how to shop. I mean, it sounds incredible, but such people exist. But in that family group setup, it may be that that group leader goes shopping with that person for the first time in their life in a way that enables them to understand how to do it. And maybe 6 months later, they've taught themselves enough language. They're no longer, they're no longer not able to read. They're starting to live a life. And I found that these groups were really effective. And they weren't all people who needed things. They were also people that were just really solid in their lives. You know, it was a real mixture of people. And when you've got a cluster of these 4 or 5 groups meeting on a weekly basis, a whole community of other people started getting involved, like the other family members. Coach trips out to so-and-so would take place. Something else would happen. And this is a thing about civil society. In Britain, we call it thick networks. That when a civil society initiative starts up, it invariably fosters something else taking place that wasn't foreseen initially. And then something else takes place. And then something else takes place. And then something else takes place. So we have a market town in a county called Somerset, not far from where I live, called Frome. 20 years ago, not in a good shape. Now, it's thriving. It has enormous numbers of people coming to its market. And, you know, they've developed a way of being together in this town where there's lots more independent shops. You know, the big multiples are no longer able to get in there anymore. The town councillors no longer do Labour or Conservative or left and right. They are together as a group of independent councillors working together for the benefit of the people of the town. So a whole different politics. You know, lots and lots of these sorts of developments. I know you've asked me for just one favourite, but I can't help but mention up around the Liverpool area, there's an NHS organisation called Merseycare, and they are aiming for zero suicide. And they have found survivors who've come into the NHS organisation, become part of how everybody is beginning to think about suicide changing. They've figured out a 40-minute training program that changes people's perceptions of suicide. And they've taken that into hairdressers, onto building sites, you know, where buildings are being built all over the Merseycare area. And the level of suicide is dropping. We have a big homeless problem in the UK. So we've got an island at the bottom of the UK called the Isle of Wight. So it's just slightly disconnected from the country, you know. But there's a homeless problem there too. And a homeless man on the Isle of Wight he found a home, and then he started to raise money. He bought a London bus, got it onto the island, raised more money, and got it fitted out so it sleeps 12 people overnight and has a kitchen. And they drive around the island picking up homeless people. And the agencies get involved to stop the bus clogging up so people move on. And it's just a brilliant development. That's civil society creativity all over for you. And Merseycare only got where it is now because it got civil society people coming in. Family groups, all their creativity is coming from ordinary people in civil society. Participle was like civil society working with civil society. Really, really effective.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm so happy you chose Participle as an example, because that was one of the examples in the book that stood out to me the most. And one of the things I particularly appreciated about it was how, you know, I read a lot of these books, the kind of books that you wrote, right? I read all of the integral, spiral dynamics, second tier Teal kind of books, and hardly any of them really focus on the importance of family. And I think that, you know, at least in the US, right, the family values and family is a very conservative narrative. It's associated with the Republican Party and people talking about family and the importance of family and having a tight-knit family. And I don't see a lot of my very liberal, progressive, integral friends or community really talking about family in the way that you have and really put that on the spotlight. And I really appreciated that, of how the Teal consciousness can really help families through the civil sector. And I really appreciated kind of highlighting that segment of society that often gets overlooked.
Well, you know, I grew up in a family with a lot of undercurrents, you know, lots of interpersonal problems and difficulties and issues. I now live in a family with none, where it's really open communication the whole time. I've got a highly functional family. It's not without difficulty. We've got family members who are really, you know, facing serious problems. But there's a context in which there's just 100% support, which can be tough at times. You have to keep working at it. You have to keep working at it.
Oh, always. You know, there's a saying, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family.
Yes.
And you know, I was extremely privileged growing up in Hawaii in a family. I had a wonderful family, wonderful upbringing. So because I was so lucky, I kind of take that for granted, and I forget how big of an impact family and upbringing has
Yeah.
for individuals and communities and society in general. And I just feel like a lot of the leading thinkers, we focus a lot on climate change and political polarization and kind of big picture issues, and we tend to overlook the family as a, you know,
Yeah.
key part
I,
of society.
I think, you know, when you mention climate change, I immediately start thinking that how does a society that can't care for its own people care for its environment? If we can't care for each other, how can we care for our environment? I
Right.
feel like a Native American Indian speaking like this, but I mean, it's true.
Yeah. And I think it also speaks to really the importance of, and something that your book laid out too, that these teal initiatives are really meeting everyone at every layer of Maslow's hierarchy, so to speak, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
if we have to really take care of the base things, people first, relationships,
Yeah.
families, in
Yeah.
order for us to actually tackle big picture environmental, you know,
Yeah.
planetary issues.
So I structured the book like that, really. It's got a couple of introductory chapters so that we get consciousness and potential sorted out. And, you know, we can see in the first chapter that the major thing that an individual can do is raise their consciousness, is develop their consciousness. And that requires quite a bit of effort. But that's, if they're going to realize more potential, that's how they're going to really do it. There's lots of things that they can do, but that comes through really strongly. And then the second chapter is kind of saying, look, in Britain, we've had this materialistic, market managerialist consciousness thrust upon us for 40 years out of the government. This is exactly what it is. This is exactly how destructive it really is. Do we really want to keep living like this? Surely not. And so then I move into family and into communities and then into organizations. And in each of those three chapters, I'm contrasting the orange type approach with the teal type approach. And you could just see, you know, it's self-evident. This is a far better way to do things. And then there's a chapter about politics, which of course we don't have a teal politics. But I've tried to unpack the thing in a very different, more teal-like kind of way. So for it to develop in the direction of teal, things have got to get a lot more local. Also, government can't hide behind spreadsheets when it pumps out direction for the locality. For local authorities in Britain, you know, the local NHS, etc., it's all coming through spreadsheets and guidance. It's like an avalanche pouring out, which the public never sees. But because I work behind the scenes as well, I saw all of that, or a lot of it anyway. I was just shocked, you know, how much removal of initiative is going on at a local level by the central state. And then I think there's a big philosophical issue in a place like Britain and probably in America, whereby you've got market thinking kinds of people, and then you've got socialist kind of thinking kinds of people.
Mm-hmm.
And the two cannot meet. And there's something wrong with that, because we should be able to be in markets and we should be able to be in communities and in, so, you know, in sociability with each other. We should be able to, I mean, the meaning of freedom probably needs to change so that it becomes about self-development. Yeah, I know. Technology is with us.
Yeah.
You know, there's something contradictory about being told how to develop yourself. So that's an important freedom. So Carol Gould, an American academic, has done a lot of work on this and pulling together the ability to trade, the ability to be an individual with freedom in society, and at the same time have that incredible potential for self-development, for your own potential to be realized by what you do with other people, and the two coming together. But our politics keeps them apart. You know, the market people are all over here. They think, you know, the state shouldn't really be there. You should earn enough money. You should have enough resources to do everything. On the other hand, there's people over here who think, well, that's never going to do it. There's always going to be people who need things. And so we should have state organizations which provide, which in Britain we call welfare. But actually, the two coming together is the next frontier, I think. So that's a kind of politics sort of flavor. And then I've got 3 chapters which are really quite specialist. One takes apart the history of the Industrial Revolution, then moves into welfare state Britain after the Second World War, and then moves into market-driven Britain from 80s onwards in Britain. And then it's really raising the possibility that these things called, you know, the state, the civil society, markets and businesses, that a very different arrangement can exist that's never been done before. And it kind of opens the way for the last chapter, where all those 50 or so initiatives on the ground that so excited you are really pushing in the direction of a civil society centered kind of country, you know, with business and the state supporting civil society. And then, you know, sandwiched between those 2 sort of specialist chapters, because it's in Britain, I really go to town on the public services. And, you know, if we want to do public services, we've got to stop doing it this way. Anyway, sorry to go on a bit there. You know, it's a little kind of journey through the book, but we can dive off in any direction you want.
Sure, sure. Thank you. Yeah, that was a helpful overview. So there are 3 things I kind of wanted to get into and kind of zoom in on a little bit. So the first one was, you had mentioned the politics needs to be more locally based. I was wondering if you kind of explain why that's important.
We've just had floods in Britain, bad floods. And I was just listening to the radio, and a woman came on and said, look, it's not a quick fix, this. We don't have the power here in the area that's been flooded to fix this ourselves. But if we had that power, we could do it. We need some more money, but we would shape how that money was spent, and we know better how to do that than people outside who don't understand this area. Well, you know, there's a kind of truth in that, that, you know, taking power up to the state. Am I talking about Britain? So it's London fundamentally. It's England and London, not Scotland. It's not Wales. It's not Northern Ireland. And they're really complaining at the moment. But I would take 90% of Whitehall, you know, the civil service, and start reorientating things around local assemblies that have got business, civil society, and public services working together. And that is going to require some Teal leadership. A lot of Teal leadership, and that's the only kind of drawback really that I could see. And if you've got local assemblies where there is resource being decided on, like what are we doing about our shopping centre? What are we doing about the high street? What are we doing about local rural transport? What are we doing about violence? What are we doing? You know, you can only decide about the realities on the ground. On the ground, it seems to me. And there are plenty of capable people, but they just don't have that power. They don't come together across the different sectors to enable them to really focus on. And I could quite easily see that, okay, if we're going to get into reducing violence, then let's set up this unit of people that come out of these different agencies and free them up to do it. So the agencies start reducing down in power and size and staffing as more and more teams of people are pulled together that come from all sorts of different backgrounds and may also include civil society people. In fact, probably should. So yeah, I think that, you know, at the moment, it's really, really difficult if you're a local authority to work together with the health service locally, together, and for the 2 to work on issues to do with housing or education. It can be done, but it's quite limited. There are lots of barriers, institutional barriers. People over here are paid in certain kinds of ways, and they have management line that controls them. And there's the other group of people over here, and they've got a line management that controls them. And, you know, it kind of militates against them really working together with and bringing themselves and their capabilities and skills to this challenging task. But every time that I've seen a team of people over the last 40 years that has carved itself into a position of having freedom to determine how it's going to go about tackling the brief, they've been unbelievably successful, and they've always involved community people. So I give some examples in the book of an advice and information centre on a huge, great housing estate. The staff there, just unbelievable, the way that they just completely work their way into the culture of the estate and lives of people there. And they were empowering people, they were training people in such a way that people didn't have to come to them. They go to their neighbour. you know, people working with learning disabilities, keeping them out of the institution. You know, the long shadow of institutions hanging over our 21st century civilization.
Mm.
It's still there, isn't it, with prisons, big time in America. You know, we have 120 prisons and they're full. And, you know, these are total institutions. They really screw people up. So here's a Teal initiative that was on television in Britain recently. That's not in the book. There's a guy called Gareth Malone is bringing choirs together in all sorts of different contexts. So military wives forming a choir, all sorts of different groupings. So he was asked by the prison governor of Aylesbury Prison, which has got young offenders who are all male, so young men who've been in prison. And can you form a choir, Gareth? Can we get prisoners singing? It didn't work out that way because they are in conflict with each other. They have to be segregated. So he found individuals that he worked with. And he found this one young man, Lewis. Lewis walks into the room. Gareth has got the keyboard. They've met 2 or 3 times before. It hasn't been going well for Lewis. He's got some mental health issues that have kept him away from being able to meet with Gareth. But this time he's broken through and he really wants to sing his song. And by now, Gareth has discovered that the prison guards are able to form the chorus. And the families of these prisoners who are going to sing as individuals are coming in as the audience together with a lot of dignitaries, you know, people associated with prisons. And so Lewis is kind of, in a way, the star song. And he just sits down with Gareth and poetically composes a song, lyrics, that describes his inner turmoil in a way that he's never described them to himself.
Wow.
Complete breakthrough. And he's got a chorus where he sings about being free and the notes just go up and up and up like a bird flying off into the sky. It's a beautiful, beautiful song. And some of the other songs are just fantastic as well. Now that's a Teal intervention in a prison setting, isn't it? Into a real orange, horrible kind of orange setting, you know.
I was gonna say, what movie is this? Is that
Yeah.
incredible?
If you Google Gareth Malone, Aylesbury, Aylesbury, it's on iPlayer, which houses all of the BBC's programs. So you'll be able to get it in America.
Wow, that's
And
amazing.
look at the second episode, and towards the end of the second episode, just beautiful, beautiful things going on. This is the creativity of the arts as well, isn't it?
Right,
Power
right.
of the arts.
Yes.
And we're seeing the arts more and more in Britain taking off in a big, big way. The developments I described in Frome, the person at the centre of it came from the arts. They looked out on this town from the standpoint of a really experienced artist. And they could see how much better it could all look. What amazing things that, you know, they could dump tons of sand in the middle of the main square on a hot summer's day and be at the beach because they think in that kind of way. And the families just loved it.
Yeah. You know, that's probably a good segue into the second thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is,
Yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question there.
I don't even remember what the original question was, but we went in an inspiring direction, you know,
I'm
singing
sorry
and
about that.
the arts. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering, one other thing you talked about in your book too was the importance of inner development and the inner transformation that's catalyzed by a lot of these initiatives and communities and relationships. And obviously the singing and the prison example is great to depict how it sounds
Yeah.
like for the prisoner, right? An amazing transformative experience.
Incredible. I mean, the hug that his father gave him after the performance just had to be seen to be believed.
Mm.
There's an entire lifetime of suffering condensed in that. Finally, it's moving for both of them as human beings, you know.
Yeah, yeah. It's just amazing. And I think arts have a unique ability to reach different arts are suitable for different people. And they're a medium to express all of the inner turmoil that hasn't been consciously excavated or explored, and to transmute it into something beautiful and aesthetically uplifting, you know,
Yeah.
really
Well,
inspiring.
I mean, in Britain, we have 12,000 part-time bands, part-time. I mean, the full-time music scene in Britain is just explodes the whole time. It's a really oppressive society in terms of your existential kind of, how you can be, the person you could be, can be. And so the arts, in a really broad general sense, are enabling so many people to develop in a way they control, and to become the person they feel they want to be.
Do you think, I remember reading it in your book too, and you had talked about fulfilling your potential and the existential freedom and the importance of that. And maybe you can give a few more examples of how this kind of inner development is being
Yeah.
catalyzed by some of these Teal initiatives.
Well, I'd like to do some more research on this. Um, but if you're, I don't know, growing vegetables in a city or a town, and you lose your partner to cancer, well, it's probably going to be the other people in the that you grow vegetables with that help you through the nightmare. When the Manchester bomber, let off the bomb at a concert, it wasn't the state that started to support the victims. It was the Warrington Peace Centre, who do this all the time, who suddenly got very, very busy, just sitting down and working with people. In my own experience, I used to drink far too much alcohol until 1996, and I had a close encounter with myself. I think it's an aspect of practicing Buddhism over such a prolonged period of time that I suddenly had a point in time when my life showed me what I was like in a way that enabled me to change it. There's a concept of karma in Buddhism, and I believe on that 10-minute experience of myself of ultra intensity, I changed my karma. And what it was I realized that back when I was 13 and my father had died of alcohol over a long 2-week period for him to die, it had bruised me in a way that I'd forgotten. And I'd forgotten what I decided to do to myself to cope with that experience. And to cope with that experience as a young 13-year-old boy, I decided to hold back a part of myself that I was never ever going to share with anybody else. And if people like your father are taken away from you in this kind of way, what can you rely on in life? But sadly, that is not a very healthy thing for a young person to do. And what happens is you have to hold up a screen so that the world and other people can't see the mess that's going on inside you. And that takes a lot of effort. And my whole family was still continuing to be part of the world of alcohol in pubs. My mother remarried somebody who drank even more. And then as a couple, they went and ran 2 unbelievably successful pubs. So by the time I was 17, 18, I was living above one of the most successful pubs in a very wealthy area of London called Belgravia. And I was still at school, I was just finishing school. Just to cut to the chase, in my intense moment in 1996, I realized I didn't have to hold back this part of myself that I wasn't going to share with anybody else anymore. And that's a really not a great way to live. But it was happening I was in a sort of state where I knew that because of the clarity of the awareness that I had actually changed this. And actually from this point onwards, there's nothing to hold back. I just need to share my life with everybody. And so no alcohol since that day on 1996. I'm not evangelical about this. I'm not going around the world trying to tell people not to drink alcohol, but I'm telling myself that I don't need to. I've done alcohol. So life has been very different since then. I had a lot more energy, that's for sure. And I've been able to be myself in a lot more contexts.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And that's something that you talked about in your book too, was how there are different kind of obstacles, right, that keep people from fully stepping into their full potential.
Yeah.
And how, and I think it's different for everyone. I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Keegan, but he's a Harvard developmental psychologist who's friends with Ken Wilber, and he talks about in one of his books how much energy it takes to suppress, how much energy it takes to keep that mask on, and to not share that in those that pent up interior angst,
Yeah.
and how much energy we spend putting on a front.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's colossal.
Right. And that has so much implications because he talks about it in the context of organizational development
Yeah.
and how how much the gears of a business or a corporate culture can be just ground down when everyone is putting so much energy into try to repress that.
Yeah. We don't have to do that, but we do have to have context in which we feel able to bring the whole of ourselves to what we're doing. So that's, I think, the mission of Teal in places like Britain and America. They have plenty of work to do.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I love that, and you kind of drew a parallel with your book to reinventing organizations, which kind of is
Yes.
the launch the Teal movement, and the web enlivening edge website and community,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how part of the Teal mission is to manifest the whole of yourself, the whole human being in the
Mm.
organization, in the community, and you're welcome to bring all of yourself into that, and also to be able to aspire to something higher that also transcends the
Yeah.
self and whatever you're doing.
I was saying that the 50 Teal-like initiatives, and I'm not sure that every single initiative that I've referenced in the book is firmly and solidly into Teal. I doubt that very much.
Mm.
I doubt that any of them really know that Teal exists in a way that is named and fully understood, But that doesn't stop people operating from it without really knowing that that's what they're doing. I think this is the beauty of the whole of Ken Wilber's way of understanding these different kinds of consciousnesses. The people involved don't necessarily need to know that this is my consciousness. But reading a book like this in a place like Britain, I think more and more people will be saying, hang on a minute, there's something in this. And I want to name this much more cogently and coherently. Anyway, with these 50 or so initiatives, I think that from what I can detect, this has got the upper left quadrant firmly working away.
Mm. Mm.
These are people who, have got something going on for themselves in developing their lives. And sometimes, in a cosmic kind of way almost.
Mm.
Our connection with the cosmos, our humanity, the notion that we have completely the same problems and issues and forces and functions at work in all of us across all cultures. And that as a humanity, we have something to share, has some kind of traction in some of these contexts. And I found about 130 more since the book's been published. So I think this is what's going on is this, the dominating 40 years of market thinking, the prehistory before that of welfare state, the industrial revolution, the class oppression, disability, race, racism, all these kind of oppressive realities are still churning away. But out of it, because there are all sorts of freedoms of thought and action, especially in civil society in a place like Britain, where people are getting control of their own, the resources amongst themselves. They're able to enact something that they decide for themselves is not going to be like the mainstream. And I see that that's a very powerful dynamic that's going on.
Mm.
It's like orange is pushing people towards teal. Unfortunately, we have these kinds of freedoms and resources in the society where people can actually create environments that are not at all to do with market thinking. They're not yet enacting self-consciously a teal-like kind of development, but that's the dynamic that I see going on. They're moving in that direction for sure.
As it's described very well in Spiral Dynamics, it's the limitations of one stage, let's say orange in this case, right, that next consciousness can push off from.
So that's a powerful energy, I think, a very powerful energy. So recently I got appointed as an honorary research fellow at a social science department at Roehampton University. It's just to the west of London. And I just finished talking with one of the other honorary fellows there, and they met somebody they knew very well, hadn't met me before, introduced me. And this person just turned to me and just said, "What are you about?" So I said, in any institution throughout the whole of Britain, and it includes Roehampton, there's a stifling potential side and there's a realizing potential side. Both are going on simultaneously. Ooh, I like you, she said. And I think that's true. That's the energy. People
Right.
still want to be relational. People still want to be relational, but they have to jump through these hoops. They have to do these things to have their jobs. So there are these compromises, there's these trade-offs. So it's also a book about navigating. How am I going to navigate my way through more of the realizing potential side of my country than the stifling potential side of my country?
Yeah, that's a good point to jump off. So um, one of the things you talked about towards the end of your book is you have those diagrams of the market
Wow.
sector and the government, and they're both bolstering the flourishing, the emerging civil sector.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering if you could talk about kind of the Teal leadership it would take to coordinate all these different sectors of society and integrate them. And kind of what is that project, if someone were to go out with their Teal mind and start doing that, what would that look like practically on the ground?
I think bringing together the three sectors with civil society at the center would have to happen. I think really this is not far fetched. In Britain, we've got hundreds of local assemblies formed within civil society. What they haven't done is bring state in or business in. I think what it takes is, like in the example of that small market town, Frome, I'm about to interact with them and suggest that chapter 9 may be a longer term vision for their town, that they've been too heavily focused on business and market, but that the civil society dimension given more prominence, and this kind of consciousness emerging amongst shop owners, people running independent businesses, small scale businesses of all different kinds, that they're there to support that civil society emergence. And then a simultaneous kind of operation going on amongst the local health service, social care, schools, about public service contribution to supporting civil society and working with civil society as well. And there are already examples in Frome of public services that are engaging with people in civil society. They're breaking down they've got a health professional who's decided to work with community people who she's calling health connectors. And so it's breaking down the isolation of the person who's got the health issue, who's on their own and isn't connected. So they're starting to do this kind of more connecting kind of process. But if you could see that within the business bit, within the civil society bit, within the state services bit, there's some degree of leadership capable of seeing beyond the current realities and doing that in a way which remains very grounded, very relational, and where we have to have dialogue with one another, where your opinions are going to differ from mine, but I'm going to listen to you anyway. And we have some ground rules that enable us to be beyond party politics and beyond I'm right, you're wrong, which is, sadly, the way a lot of leadership disintegrates in Britain, where it's amber and it's orange or it's green or those three together. We're seeing a tremendous amount of polarization, tremendous amount of pointing of fingers, and of people in new initiatives blowing apart because they just can't work together. It's very sad. So it's not easy, what I'm talking about, but it absolutely requires Teal-like leadership, I think. This Teal-like leadership has got this ability to hear from people in a much more realistic way and know that there's this different consciousness this person is coming from, but not to think they're wrong. It is a different consciousness. And we have to find a way to work with it. We have to find a way to work together. And eventually, people working together in that kind of way shift in their consciousness, I think. I think this is what Frederick Laloux's found, is that, within a place like Favy, it's blue collar, northern France, metalworking kind of company. But I think that those consciousnesses, they must be shifting. They must have shifted pretty quickly at that early stage. That leadership must have been enable them to come along with them. I think the middle management were the ones that had the problem, the former middle management. So, with all these kinds of things, there is always the ground maintenance going on. People are using social media to try and attack it. So we have to have a presence there that counters it. We've got, people will put stories in the media saying, I didn't want this to happen. Nobody consulted me. So you're going to have ground maintenance going on all the time. And I'm sure in, the Teal organizations that Frederick Laloux has researched, those kind of processes become built in as well.
Right, right.
Not an easy route, but it's a lot less oppressive, and it means that a lot more people can become and fulfill their potential and feel free within a working environment, or within an environment of shared undertaking.
Yeah, I really like the adding the dimensions, or really carving out the sectors of society, right? The market
Yeah,
sector, civil society, and government, and
yeah,
how they can be collaborated and integrated, and relate to each other, connect with each other in a way that's actually productive and
yes,
mutually beneficial for all stakeholders.
yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering, as a kind of a very specific question, maybe you can give an example from your own life. Um, where were some of these connections, what sector were they initiated from? So if you were with your teal consciousness, right? Was it civil society reaching out to markets or and government? Was the government initiating the connection? Like, where does that movement start from?
Well, I can only talk about the history and the evidence of the movement from Industrial Revolution Britain to welfare state Britain to market thinking Britain. And in both those cases, from the Industrial Revolution through to welfare state Britain, there was something like a 50-year process in which the sheer oppression of Industrial Revolution Britain, I mean, the vast numbers of poor people, people in poverty in the big cities across the country is just huge, absolutely huge. But it took World War II before a deal was done, and the deal was we can't go on anymore with Victorian Britain oppressing the people. We have to find a solution. And that solution has got to be through dealing with homelessness, dealing with health, bad health, dealing with poor education. And so the whole of the welfare state concept was born. And it came through elites. It came through the elite. There's a guy called Beveridge, had been masterminding all sorts of social change during the 40s, the late 30s and the 40s. And he was part of the elite with Churchill. There have been all kinds of working groups and processes going on at elite level. But eventually it was the Second World War that meant that Beveridge and the whole kind of welfare state platform suddenly became center stage. Because, during a war, the state took over control of virtually everything. And it was a time of Keynesianism, Roosevelt's New Deal. So there was this kind of sense from America that, the state can make things happen. The state can run these big organizations. And there was this big consciousness about administration and, management, scientific management. So all this kind of consciousness is coming together. Weber, legal rational authority, because you can replace people. And so this whole notion that you could have these big, big bureaucracies and the state could occupy the center ground, and civil society and business will be off to either side, being influenced by the state. So if you're running a business during that period, you have to have a filing cabinet. You have to have a mini bureaucracy. And then, there's another kind of group of people who think that that is just slavery. And these are the marketeers, the market thinking people. Flower power didn't figure. The psychologically kind of motivated, kind of existentially orientated kind of approach of, hippodom did not change Britain at a political level. The market thinking people did, and they got organized. And so there was a society called the Mont Pelerin Society, led by somebody called Friedrich Hayek, who strongly influenced Margaret Thatcher. And she became the kind of political representative of the Mont Pelerin Society's kind of thinking about everything has to be centered around markets. Where we're going with these big, mass liberal democracy society is not bureaucracy. We're not going to run them through bureaucracy. We're going to run them through markets. And so that there's another elite kind of thing going on here. But I think when we move towards civil society-centered countries, that can't happen by definition. It's got to come from the ground, and it's got to come from people across the sectors, led by civil society and from the ground. So this is why I'm so encouraged by so many initiatives bubbling up from within Britain's civil society, and also the state, and also business. You know, that the potential is obviously there. And people are doing this in a way which is not coordinated. It's not run by some kind of elite. It's not some think tank. I think all that's gone. It's gone. There's another consciousness and nobody can control it. No politician and no institution can control this teal consciousness. And that's the consciousness, I think, that will power a very different kind of political kind of connection between the state, civil society and business. Those power relationships changing. It's going to be definitely got to be an organic kind of, you know, ground upwards, slow moving kind of process, which then builds and builds and builds. And, you know, today we have fantastic communication. Information just gets everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. I loved the vision so much. I mean, it's so funny how I came to the exact same conclusion. I mean, really rather intuitively. I don't have a lot of experience like you, or I'm not even the most well read on these subjects, but it just kind of felt like it was civil society's turn, you know?
Precisely. Well, if you think that, how many other thousands and thousands of people do too?
Right, exactly. And I just keep on going back to how the decentralized network, peer-to-peer relationships on the ground, face-to-face
Yeah,
contact and community, that can
yeah,
solve so many problems, especially problems with interiors and
yeah,
people's existential and emotional suffering,
yeah,
and just all the markets, you know, market for-profit mechanisms and government welfare programs are great in some ways, but they just, as you're saying, they can't really get to that heart place, you know, which is really this kind of, I see as kind of like a underbelly of pain in society that just cannot be fully healed unless it's through a civil society
yeah,
network relation.
yeah. No, I think so. I think the examples of public services that I've seen that work, they've worked much more like civil society undertakings from within the system. They've thrown all the kind of rule books out, and well, not all of them, but quite a few of them. And so they've suddenly become recognizable to the people they're trying to work with. You know, there was a thing went round the estate I worked on in the 70s where we had this advice and information center. There was a particular point where the population on the estate basically said, oh, this is good. We can get something from it, these people. This works. They know what they're doing.
Yeah, it's amazing how I love the example you gave of, oh man, where was it? Was it, I want to say like Denmark, but or the Netherlands, I think, where
Yeah,
they had basically gave the employees like maximum amount of freedom in
yeah.
the, I can't remember what department it was in. Can you explain that again?
I think it was the Social Security, the
That's
benefits.
right.
Yeah, and there's also the, the youth counselling, TIJO, in Antwerp, I think it is. The people doing the counselling can't do it in their day jobs in the state, so they grouped together and formed this voluntary organisation in civil society, and did it outside of their day job, and the whole thing just exploded in a really good way. They were able to do what they really needed to do without any of the interference. It's the same across a whole lot of disciplines in the UK. You know, in midwifery, there are independent midwives now. They don't work for the state. With acquired brain injury, there's a whole lot of professionals grouped together doing consultations with people with an acquired brain injury outside of the state.
Yeah, the creativity and creative potential is endless. It's limitless.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know.
yeah. And I can see that happening in America. It's definitely happening in Britain. And I suspect that in other countries in Europe. Well, I'm going to find out. So I'm going to the European Integral Conference.
Oh, nice.
If it's still going to be held, because we've got the coronavirus. But if it is, I'm going to find out from people in other countries where they're at with these kind of conversations. Apparently, 700 people coming to the conference.
That's great.
We
And
could have another Zoom call post conference.
yeah, definitely get the breakdown of what
Yeah,
all of the
happening across Europe.
yeah, yeah, totally. Yes, thank you so much. This has been really enlightening conversation, and whenever I talk about Teal ideas or the, you know, the reinventing organization-esque project, I always feel so much creativity and kind of inspiration, and then the thought of that seeping into all of the sectors of society,
Yeah,
that's kind of like why that's
yeah.
my purpose, you know. So thank you so much.
Nighttime in Hampshire to not quite so early morning where you are.
That's right. I'm
have,
just getting started here.
have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you.
All right.
Cheers.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye.